Help sick and injured children by donating to my Extra Life campaign. Link in the description and pinned comment. All proceeds go to Children's Wisconsin. If we reach $1,000, I'll make my Discord server public. So Tom Brady really just decided he couldn't let prima donna Aaron Rodgers have all the drama, huh? There's a lot of great video game franchises out there, filled with lots of widely beloved games. Of course, every series has to start somewhere. The problem is, there are a lot of situations where it can take a series time to really find its footing. This can be for a number of reasons, like not quite having a game's mechanics refined yet, or not having fully decided what direction you want to take. As a result, the first game in a franchise is rarely its best. We call this phenomenon first game syndrome. And what I bring to the table today are 10 games that haven't quite aged as gracefully as later sequels for whatever reason. Whether it took one sequel or more for the franchise to hit its stride, there's no denying that these first games had issues that later games would address. Just goes to show you that when you're starting out, growing pains are to be expected. Kinda like how a lot of YouTube channels started out. It's game time! So let's start off with everyone's favorite Devil Hunter. Nowadays, Devil May Cry 5 has re-established the series as one of Capcom's heavy hitters. People loved its free-flowing and stylish combat, as well as Dante's signature style and attitude. So it may surprise some people to hear that the original DMC was originally going to be a Resident Evil game. Looking at the game itself, however, yeah, I can see it. Starting with, fittingly enough, fixed camera angles. Good for survival horror, but they go together with a hack and slash like toothpaste and orange juice. Maybe that's why some people wait 30 minutes after brushing their teeth. This is especially troublesome with enemies that can be off camera when they attack, and even more so with certain bosses where the camera is more of a threat than the actual boss. Not to mention situations where platforming is involved. Yeah, maybe shifting game styles mid-development might have warranted more dev time to know what you wanted to do. Aside from that, melee weapons had mostly the same moves, differing mainly in stats and special abilities, and a lack of mission select basically means the only way to get items you missed is to do a New Game Plus. And the story didn't know if it wanted to be suspenseful, action-packed, or dramatic. Granted, it's not all bad, the combat is fluid enough, if a bit basic, and some of the bosses are pretty cool. It's not a bad game, just a bit awkward. However, the reason it's at the bottom is because the second game is notably worse. It wasn't until the third game where the franchise hit its stride. Refine the combat, make the weapons more varied, and let Dante be Dante, and you've got a party. With Sonic Frontiers in the works, the struggle of the blue hedgehog to maintain consistency in 3D is once again brought to the forefront. But when you really think about it, is it really all that surprising that Sonic has been hit or miss in 3D? Well, not really, considering that Sonic didn't burst out of the box at full speed in 2D either, huh? Sonic was marketed as a character with two things, speed and attitude. And yeah, in the original game you could really go fast, for about the first few levels or so. After that, though, the level design was hit or miss, with the misses failing to really play to Sonic's speed. All I have to say is Labyrinth Zone and I'll be able to hear physical cringing from halfway across the country. In fact, some areas outright punished it as early as Marble Zone. It's like half the levels in the game were designed after it was decided that speed should be Sonic's gimmick. The fact that the iconic spin dash wasn't added until the second game didn't do anything to help matters on that front. And many of the boss fights were bland compared to later games, typically against the Eggomatic and its various gadgets. That being said, the good levels were pretty damn good. Green Hill, for how much it's been overused in recent years, is iconic for a reason, with it being probably one of the best ways to introduce a character based on gaining and maintaining momentum, while Spring Yard and Starlight Zones did a decent job of working with that idea. And even back then, the music was pretty catchy, the previously mentioned Labyrinth Zone notwithstanding. The basic enemy design was also varied enough so that you couldn't just handle every problem the same way. But there's no denying that there were some issues that later games would work out. And yet, when this game was ported to the Game Boy Advance 15 years later, it turned out to be the worst thing to happen to 2D Sonic. Probably the best way to play the original is Christian Whitehead's version, which not only adds the spin dash, but makes Tails and Knuckles unlockable. Not surprising, considering he would later be the driving force behind Mania. Exclusives are a huge selling point for a console, and for PlayStation fans, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart was high on the list of reasons to keep a finger on the trigger for the exact second any sign of a PS5 popped up on the radar. Something supply chain issues, something chip shortages. Given that critics and fans both generally love the game, it certainly paints a bright future for the iconic duo. As for how they began, well, while the first game is still good with a wide assortment of weapons, great environments, and a lot of variety, there are a few glitches in the machinery that later games would work out. For starters, for all those weapons you could obtain, you couldn't upgrade them except with gold bolts, and simply buying the weapons meant you needed a lot of regular bolts, which simply aren't as plentiful as they would be in later installments. And for the bolts you did collect, you'd be better off prioritizing health upgrades. Yeah, those had to be bought in the first game, as opposed to being gained through leveling up. And considering you started with only 4 health, which could be eventually upgraded to as many as 8, there's little margin for error. Any mistake cost you a whole hit point no matter what hit you, be it a rocket or a stray bullet from off-screen. There were 2 big issues that made cheap hits more likely. The first is that the quick menu didn't pause the action, meaning you could be caught by surprise as you tried to change weapons on the fly. Granted, you could use the pause menu to change weapons, but that was a bit awkward. And second, and the biggest issue, no strafing. Now, I'm not sure if this is because the proper conventions of third-person shooters hadn't yet been established, but in a game where weapons are a main focus, the lack of a proper strafing mechanic is honestly baffling. And it seems like Insomniac hadn't quite perfected the proper balance between a shooter and a platformer yet. Thankfully, the rest of the gameplay worked out well, and not only made the original a game worth returning to, but laid the foundation for a franchise that became a PlayStation staple. Okay, by now my abject love for Mega Man is so well known and thoroughly documented that it may as well be the free space on my bingo board. That being said, my introduction to the series was Mega Man 2. I didn't even play the first game until maybe a year or 2 later. Turns out I didn't necessarily miss all that much. As a game on its own, it's not bad, but as the launching point for a beloved franchise, it feels like a prototype more than anything else. The foundation is there, it just had some bugs in the system that had to be worked out. The controls felt a little stiff, especially when falling off a platform and being yanked down by black hole gravity. Not to mention a lack of water physics in areas like Iceman's stage. There were also some cases of questionable level design. Gutsman's platforms and Elecman's first screen come to mind, as well as any area with spikes which even iframes can't save you from. The game was also really short, mainly due to it being on a small amount of ROM. 6 Robot Masters instead of 8, along with 4 endgame stages, and the levels themselves were all relatively short compared to later games. Not to mention, the boss rush that would become a series staple was spread out in a fixed order over 2 of the Wily stages instead of the now iconic teleporter room. And they didn't even give you health pickups when you won the rematches. Other design decisions that wouldn't stick included the lack of E-tanks, a single missable support item instead of having them as end-of-level rewards, a full-on enemy-filled hallway before each boss fight, and a scoring system for some unknown reason. Honestly, was Capcom so used to making arcade games that they figured a console-only game had to have points that serve no purpose? That being said, most of the boss fights were fun and challenging, with a couple notable exceptions. The weapons were cool for the most part, and the music started a grand tradition of kick-ass tunes. But pretty much everything this game did would be done so much better in later games that it's hard to come back to the original. Unless you have the Legacy Collection, in which case, go ahead. Naughty Dog's fall from grace as a development studio has been widely documented, given allegations of abuse, harassment, and ungodly crunch culture. They used to have quite a reputation, though, given their work with series like Uncharted. The adventures of Nathan Drake have painted him as quite the badass treasure hunter. Yeah, that's the term I'm looking for. Of course, before he could get to this, he had to go through... well, this. Yeah, the first Uncharted game definitely had some growing pains before the series really hit its stride. For starters, let's talk about the setting. Nearly all of the game takes place on the island as opposed to the more varied settings of later games. Only 3 chapters or so take place outside the areas of the island itself. We had more variety as early as Uncharted 2. The story is a lot more simplistic than later games as well, especially when it comes to the relationships between characters. Take a look at the relationship between Drake and Sully in the first game, as opposed to the third game, and you'll probably have a good idea of what I'm talking about here. But the biggest issues with Uncharted 1 came from the gameplay. Let's start with the QuickTime events. They tend to come at very inopportune times and add little to nothing to the gameplay. Not to mention they're as unforgiving as the refs in the NFL, with a small window between you and a severe punishment, sometimes being instant death. As far as climbing goes, there's a lot of it, and it isn't always clear where you can safely grab and where you can't. You may think you're clear to jump, but you may end up jumping straight into the pits of hell. But the big issue with Uncharted 1 is the shootouts in the game. To put it simply, shootouts in Uncharted 1 are the source of about 90% of complaints about the game. Goons take forever to kill without headshots, have stupidly powerful weapons, could shoot a fly from across downtown Milwaukee, and are about as numerous as bars in Wisconsin. And that's before ticking all the boxes that people hate about cover systems. In fact, the whole final chapter pretty much encapsulates most of the first game's issues. How fitting that it's a fight with the game's worst villain. Seriously, he's only the main villain for like 10 minutes before he gets a cartoonishly pathetic death. Oh hey, another game by Naughty Dog that fell victim to early installment weirdness. In the early days of the PS1, Sony was pushing hard for the Maniac Marsupial as a mascot for their new competitor to Mario. Those old commercials were pretty funny, not gonna lie, and while both Mario 64 and the original Crash innovated 3D platforming in different ways, to say that the Bandicoot had a few serious hiccups starting out wouldn't be exaggerating one bit. Let's start with the controls. Remember, this was one of the first PS1 games to come out, meaning this was before the advent of the now iconic DualShock. In other words, this was a D-pad game, which may have worked at the time for a 3D platformer, but geez is it hard to come back to. Movement feels stiff, and with a slight delay when starting or stopping to run, it can definitely throw you off at times. Jumping also feels heavy, sometimes causing you to fall just short of your next platform, and it doesn't help that you maintain forward momentum after jumping on an object. Not the best use of physics-based realism when you require precision, and this stiff control can especially get in your way when you want to save your game. Yeah, you heard me. Let me explain. In Crash 1, there are only two places you can save. The first is after completing a bonus stage, which are accessed by collecting 3 Tawna or Cortex tokens in a level. However, once you complete it, you can't go back. The second way is to save with the gems. To get a gem in Crash 1, you need to break every crate in a level and complete it, all without dying once. Now, not only is this easier said than done, but again, once you collect a gem, you can't recollect it. To wit, there is a limited number of saves throughout the whole game. Thankfully, later Crash games, and by extension the Insane trilogy, fixed the save system, letting you save on the map. Granted, Crash's graphics and soundtrack were really good for early PS1, the bosses had good ideas behind them, and some of the levels were really well made, but if you want to experience Crash 1, your best bet is buying the Insane trilogy. Used. That way Activision doesn't get your money.
Until Bobby Kotick and his goon squad are out on their butts, they don't deserve your cash.
Man, does it feel good again to be a Metroid fan. After a period where the only things from the franchise were a big misfire and a spin-off that came out at completely the wrong time, we were gifted with a solid remake of the second game, and a few years later, a long-forgotten project ended up becoming one of the best games in the series. Kinda makes you forget how rough the series started.
Yeah, the original Metroid really makes it clear just how limited games were at the time with their technology.
While the first game was groundbreaking as one of the first exploration-based platformers, there were quite a few rough spots. The first being apparent as soon as you spawn with 30 energy. Every time. This means you have to grind for health every time you respawn, which just wastes more of your time. This may be due to the limited cartridge resources for the US version, compared to the storage of the Famicom Disk System version in Japan, but this is pretty significant. It doesn't even matter how many energy tanks you have. You die, you respawn with the same 30 health, meaning dying only gets worse the further you get in. Another thing which was limited in the beginning was the versatility of your beam. You couldn't stack beam types, it was either wave or ice, and having to choose isn't nice. Diagonal aiming wasn't an option either, and you couldn't even shoot the full length of the screen without the long beam. This is the only original game in the series that has this item, by the way, but the biggest limitation of the original Metroid comes with the lack of an in-game map. The NES at the time simply didn't have the capacity to have a feature to tell you where you were, and this was especially troublesome because a lot of corridors looked the same, leading to getting lost and wasting more of your time. Later games would fix pretty much all of these issues and improve the feel of the controls, with Metroid 2 ditching the long beam and giving players a proper save system, and Super Metroid finally giving you beam stacking and a map! And given that Zero Mission exists, which not only addresses most of the original's limitations, but expands the lore of the first mission on Zebes, there's really no reason to go back to the original other than nostalgia. We all know Samus is a woman by now, it's no big shocker anymore. Before Square Enix, there was just Square and Enix, both companies renowned for revolutionizing RPGs, with Enix's signature franchise being Dragon Quest, and Square being known for Final Fantasy. While the franchise has swerved in quite a few different directions leading to now, the Super Nintendo and the PS1 eras had a good degree of consistent quality, and the original NES game actually helped save a then-desperate Square from going bankrupt. Looking back at it today, however, you can see that it took a while for the series to find its identity. In fact, the first game in the series was essentially a Dungeons & Dragons game in all but name, starting with the formation of your initial party, choosing a class, giving your character a name. All that's missing is rolling for stats and giving your characters personalities. The only other games where you had self-inserts were 3's Famicom release and the MMOs. Next similarity, the Bestiary. A lot of it was pulled wholesale from D&D, including Mind Flayers and Beholders, the latter of which were changed into one-eyed skulls to avoid a lawsuit. Several staple creatures like chocobos, adamantoises, Marlboros, and behemoths wouldn't show up until the second game. Next, magic, which basically amounts to D&D's spell slots. Spells were divided into levels, you had to buy them at magic stores, and you could only cast each level of spell a certain number of times before you had to refill them by resting. MP didn't even become standard until the SNES era. But the biggest sources of first game awkwardness could be seen in battle. First, instead of positioning your character strategically to aggro enemies, your party order determines the likelihood of being attacked, with your party leader probably taking the brunt of it. In other words, the best strategy was to let your tank take point. Second, you know how some of the later games had equipment that dealt multiple hits on enemies, or certain enemies could attack more than once? Well, in the first game, that was all RNG. Third, and the biggest issue with battle, was the lack of any auto-targeting. If a character's target died to someone else's attack before their turn came up, they'd be swinging at air. And, well, intimidation doesn't work in this game. Much like Metroid, if you want to experience the story of the original, you're better off playing a remake, be it on GBA, PS1, or heck, even the Pixel remaster. Because if you're going for the original, you're bound to run into some, well...
bullshit.
Okay. Do I think it's a little early for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet? Well, that kinda depends. My main concern isn't the time frame per se. After all, 3 to 4 years has always been the time frame for a generation. I'm just hoping the team that worked on Legends Arceus isn't the same team working on Generation 9. Freaking crunch. Regardless, one thing that I can expect is that it won't have the same awkwardness of Gen 1. Okay, we all know what a revolution that RBY was in ushering in the now most profitable franchise in media, but it's also a case study in how the limitations of hardware can obstruct on a studio's ambition. Compared to the improvements, gimmicks, and quality of life changes we've seen since, the OG is so old school it's practically bedridden in the nursing home by now. The list of bugs and issues with Gen 1 is so long you could make a CinemaSins video out of it. For example, did you know that the only way to check how close you were to gaining a level in Gen 1 was to access the menu? No meter here, that wasn't until Gen 2. Another odd quirk that later games would change is having your Pokemon retain their status when sent to a box for storage. And you couldn't even organize your boxes in Gen 1 either, or capture any Pokemon if your current box was full. Next, the limits of your item bag. Come on, only 20 different items and no separate pouches? Even school backpacks are better than that. But by far, the biggest cases of awkwardness with Gen 1 came from its terrible balancing issues. You know how powerful Dragon types were played up to be? Yeah, there was only the Dragonite line, its only damaging Dragon-type move was the fixed damage Dragon Rage, and only Ice-type moves could be super effective against them. Critical hits and one-hit KOs were based on speed, meaning faster Pokemon essentially held all the cards. But none of these imbalances hold a candle to the unseen hand that telekinetically holds down the entire scale.
The psychic type.
Sweet, merciful Arceus, who wasn't introduced until 3 generations later. Psychic types bent the Gen 1 meta like a spoon. The only damaging bug-type moves at the time sucked. The ghost-type moves that were supposed to be super effective were rendered useless by a programming error. The only ghost-type blend at the time was also part poison, and the psychics had punishing attacks and dominating status moves. Especially Amnesia. Amnesia was basically Super Saiyan mode, thanks to special attack and defense occupying a single stat. Psychic types are still powerful today, but back then they were so powerful, Gen 2 had to introduce 2 new types to counter them. Add to that numerous bugs and glitches, and there's hardly any reason to go back to the originals, especially when Fire Red and Leaf Green exist. Being a Pokemon fan is suffering. Now before we move on, here are some honorable mentions. The Legend of Zelda 1, Halo Combat Evolved, Tekken 1, the first Mass Effect, and the first Assassin's Creed. Now let's see what the Arcade Nation has to say with this month's patron picks.
Star Fox for the Super Nintendo. While it looked amazing at its time, it doesn't age as great as the later games.
Bad controls, weird visual format, as well as AI that legitimately cheats. Only computer players can use items like the Poison Mushroom and Yoshi Egg, and the Marios can just turn on the Starman whenever they want. And sweet Arceus, it'll make you motion sick. Seriously though, why the heck did the map take up half the screen?
This game has clunky controls, a pseudo-collectathon aesthetic, and an open world that's linear. At least the later sequels fine-tune most of it, as well as give the rest of the main cast some time in the spotlight. Gotta love progress.
Well, when I first mentioned this topic on my Twitter.com, I did get a lot of responses, but one game kept coming up continuously. And I can't say I blame them one bit. So I'm not even gonna bother with building this up. It's time to rip off the Band-Aid and explain why we don't talk about Street Fighter 1. Yeah, I know, 35th anniversary and all that. That just makes it all the more important to talk about this game, because it makes it all the more clear just how far the franchise has come since then. And honestly, if one were to play Street Fighter 1 for the first time after having played virtually any other Street Fighter game, they may find themselves wondering how the franchise survived this long. The leap from Street Fighter 1 to Street Fighter 2 is so significant that one can barely tell it's the same franchise were it not for the fundamentals. Sure, they're all there, the life bars, the best of 3 matches, the 6-button format, command-based specials and all that, but the game as a whole is so janky-kang that mastering it would drive lesser men to insanity. How about starting with the fact that there was no character select? Only Ryu and Ken were playable, and they were locked to your player position. Player 1 was Ryu, Player 2 was Ken, and 10 other opponents you could never play as, each with the same win and lose quotes that sounded like the adults in the Peanuts cartoons. Other things that we see as standard in fighting games, like stuns, throws, and combos, just straight up didn't exist in this game. And the controls. Dear Lord in heaven, the controls! Ground movement was restricted to awkward hopping along the floor instead of the smooth walking we've gotten used to. In other words, good luck positioning yourself with any degree of precision. Jumping isn't much better in all honesty. And by the way, those 6-button controls, they were an afterthought built into later versions of the cabinet as an alternative. Why? The original cabinet actually had hydraulic pads that gauged the strength of punches and kicks based on how hard you hit them. And not only was it awkward, it was expensive as fuck. But the worst part was the special moves. Yeah, they were incredibly powerful and could end a round in seconds, if you could actually use them. Pulling them off felt like trying to roll a nat 20 with a loaded d20. More often than not, the Shoryuken felt like a Shoryu crapshoot. I'd find it hard to believe that anyone beat this game back in the day without a shitload of quarters. The worst part is, Street Fighter 1 was the only game in the main series outside of the Alpha and EX games which didn't get any updates. The original was all you had. And considering the way that later Street Fighter games had at least 2 updates each, this was the one that could have used it the most.
And yet, without any of these games, we wouldn't have gotten the franchises we know today. Without Sonic's early limits and awkward levels, we wouldn't have gotten the smoothness of later games like Sonic 3 and Knuckles and Sonic Mania. Without the original Metroid with all its limitations, we wouldn't have epic adventures like Metroid Dread. And yes, without the jank of the original Street Fighter, we wouldn't have had Street Fighter 2, and the entire fighting game genre as we know it might not exist today. Join me next month for another QG at the Arcade as we take a look at just how Street Fighter II changed everything. I'm the Quarter Guy, and until next time, the arcade is closed.
Hey everyone, QG here. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share the video around. Feel free to check out my Twitter and my Twitch streams, and consider supporting me through Patreon and donating to my Extra Life campaign to support Children's Wisconsin. Thanks for watching.